talking about the basement as tribal consciousness. First floor is rational, second floor is psychic, and our roof deck as mystical. You know, in the basement, you're down in the panic room, you don't have windows, you don't see outside. On the first floor, you look out, you see things that are at your level. On the second floor, you see the tops of the trees. And on the deck, you see over the trees to the lake beyond. Now, none of these is bad. This is very, very important. No level of consciousness is bad. Each has its appropriateness. The basement is a good place to go sometimes when you're being pursued, when you need to survive. And the first floor is fine, and the second floor and the deck. It's just kind of a model to think of where you hang out most of the time in your house. And then, as we hear these responses tonight, sort of what floor the response comes from. So let's talk about those a little more. Tribal consciousness is black-white consciousness. Us, them. Black hat, white hat. It's a consciousness that we describe as one narrative, one story. Thus, it's a consciousness that's not capable of dialogue. Right now, as we speak, a group of teenagers are meeting, and I'm on the board for this group called Hands of Peace. On the board are 4 Jews, 4 Muslims, 4 Christians, and I'm going to be talking to them Monday night at a church in Glenview. We have 7 Israeli Jews, 2 Israeli Arabs, 7 Palestinian Muslims, 2 Palestinian Christians, and a variety of high school kids who are American Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They engage in 2 weeks of intense dialogue, and the purpose is to get them to the point of appreciating what we call a meta-narrative. Because the Israeli kids come with the Israeli narrative, you know, we Jews came to a land, there were no people here, we built everything up, we've always been nice to the Arabs. And the Arab story, you know, the Jews came in, kicked us all out, and they've been beating us up ever since. And the idea is that by the end of the 2 weeks, they reach a meta-narrative, a narrative that incorporates the narrative of the other. And the program is generally successful. It's been charted over a number of years, and interestingly enough, it seems to be universally successful for the high school girls in the program. It occasionally fails with some of the boys. Now, they're hand-picked. You know, the families are interviewed. We have permanent teams over in the Middle East, and so families are interviewed. They don't just take people randomly. But still, there are a few people for whom it doesn't take. At the end of the 2 weeks, they still say, I've got the right narrative. I know the enemy better. But that's rare. Usually only maybe 1 teenager a year that it fails with. So generally, we get to the meta-narrative. The meta-narrative is up on the next level. It gets to the first floor. Now, I usually give this kind of a talk early in the program, and I was told last year that a day or so after my talk, some of the students started wearing little signs that said, "Get out of the basement." Get out of the basement. That became kind of a catchword, I guess, was get out of the basement. So when someone made a comment that was obviously from the basement, people would say, get out of the basement. And so it gave them a way of talking about that. The first floor is rational. This to me is John Stuart Mill and John Locke and Jefferson. It's the realm of civil discourse. It's it's something that most Americans have been socialized to. Dr. Ossie, who was one of our teachers in Common Ground, who's from Pakistan, right, said once, he said, you Americans don't appreciate some wonderful things. He said, like the day after an election, you get up and go to work. He said, you don't hide in the basement waiting for the bloodbath and the coup. you know, when we're functioning the way we function, the candidate that lost said, you know, congratulations to my opponent, I wish her well, and life goes on. That comes from rational discourse. I mean, that comes from Madison saying, if I can't convince you by my argument, then, you know, I'm obliged to support your right to disagree with me. Okay. This to me is kind of the best part of America. On my website, I have a bunch of little essays, and one of them is called Proud to be an American. And it's based on a thing that was on television about 15 Ku Klux Klansmen somewhere in Alabama having a little meeting on the streets, and they're all in their little white robes, and they're surrounded by a rather hostile crowd, and they're all chanting these anti-black slogans and so on. And they're protected by a cordon of police officers. And about half the police officers were African American. And it moved me to tears, because I thought, this is the America I'm proud of. Disciplined African American police officers protecting people who are shouting insults at African Americans. But as John Stuart Mill said, you know, if you do me no harm, as long as you don't injure me, I'll defend your right to disagree with me. That to me is quintessential America. Rational, civic discourse. Now we go to the realm that's transrational. Now, a lot of people don't affirm the transrational. They believe that our development ends at the rational. A lot of our education is to bring people from tribal opinions to a level of rational discourse. And most of the time we feel if you reach rational discourse to any degree, you deserve your diploma and you can walk across the stage and graduate. But others believe that there is life beyond the rational. Now, beyond the rational doesn't mean it replaces it. The image used here is always of these Russian dolls where the one contains the others. So we come to the psychic realm. Some of you heard Ken James when he spoke recently at Common Ground. He's a Jungian analyst. You know, he does a lot with dreams and with intuitions. His point, he says, our conscious mind is like a pea floating on the Pacific Ocean. And he said the unconscious is coming up in various ways to be assimilated. And it comes up through, you know, Freudian slips, through dreams, through physical symptoms, through what Jung calls synchronicity, odd little coincidences. But it wants to come up and enrich and inform our consciousness. And for Jung, this is also the archetypal realm that emerges into our conscious as well. So that's a psychic realm. Ken Wilber says this is when you begin to understand your life as more than your choices and decisions and plans. When we begin to understand that there are more forces working in our lives than just that little bit that's determined by our rational choices and our plans. In other words, there's a Pacific Ocean and not just the pea. That's a psychic realm.
I think you got to give us more.
Okay, more. Intuitions.
More than the ocean and the pea.
All right. I already gave more than the ocean and the pea.
Oh, I forgot to write that down.
I know. Intuitions. You know, studies have been taken of CEOs and say that the best CEOs, the bureaucrats come in and say, here's the data, the next franchise should be in Woodstock. And they say, yeah, I see it, but I got a feeling here. Let's put it in Crystal Lake. And this seems to characterize some of the best CEOs. It's intuition. It's transrational. The data indicate the franchise should go in Woodstock. There's no rational reason to put it in Crystal Lake. But you got a hunch. Synchronicity. Strange little coincidences. A student was standing in my office one day looking at the bookshelf. He was not touching it. And a book fell off. You know? He picked it up. It was a book that I was actually going to talk to him about. Reading. You know, I think when that stuff happens, read the book. I think the universe is saying something. Read the book. Dreams. Twice in my life I did dream analysis during two critical changes. One when I was leaving the Jesuits, and then one at the time of my divorce. Very valuable information. Stuff in my dreams that never, I don't know, that my conscious mind would never figure out. At our winter retreat that Jim and I did, I was supposed to talk Saturday morning on ways in which religion can get caught up in rules and miss its deeper essence. And I went to sleep that night thinking, I want a good example for tomorrow morning, but I'm not sure what I'm going to use. And that night I had a dream. And in the dream, I was Jewish, and a friend of mine, an older woman I knew, was dying through being a member of the Hemlock Society. In other words, she was drinking a potion that was going to take her life, and you know, none of this has any logic except in the dream, and she had chosen to die in a synagogue. So I come rushing to the synagogue, and she's sitting there, and people are lined up saying goodbye to her, and I rush into the synagogue, you know, to get in line and say goodbye to her, and someone says to me, "You can't come in here, you're not wearing a yarmulke, not wearing a kippah." And I said, "My Judaism is in my heart, not on my head." And I woke up. And I said, "That's the story I'm going to use." You know, I just don't know that my rational mind would have thought of that. It came from a different place. Okay? So this is the realm we call the psychic realm. And finally there's the mystical. That's the roof deck. This is the hardest to talk about because, as we've been saying since last night, the mystical is from mu, silence. It's what can't really be spoken in ordinary language. In other words, ordinary language is dualistic. You learn apple, non-apple, chair, non-chair. Most language is kind of a binary system. The mystical is unity. You think something's separate, and the Hindu teacher says, "No, Tattvam Asi, that art thou, you are that." It's unity language. And it's very hard to express, and consequently, the mystics use metaphors. Or humor. Take the teaching of Jesus, love your enemies. Well, at the tribal level, we kill our enemies. At the rational level, we negotiate with our enemies. At the psychic level, we begin to understand our enemies. At the mystical level, we love our enemies, but that means that's a joke. Because to love an enemy means not to have an enemy. So at that level, the enemy disappears. But the teaching only makes sense at the mystical level. And Jesus had to say it in a kind of a joke. Love your enemies. I mean, that's silly. It doesn't compute. It's funny. It's weird. It's nonsensical. You love your enemies. Enemies are the people you hate. But that's what we find when we bring together the mystics and the different traditions. We find certain common characteristics. Deep peace of mind, a sense of joy, compassion, and embracing wisdom. And I think, you know, as you see in someone like the Dalai Lama, this, and as I see in the teachings of Jesus, this kind of gentle humor, which I think is part of a profound humility, not taking yourself too seriously. The Dalai Lama, you know, Jim has been with him much more than I have, but he tells these little stories about himself that most of us wouldn't tell because they're kind of embarrassing. At the Parliament he said once, and I should have Jim do the imitation, I can't imitate. He said, once he said, I'm sitting on the stage and this little girl comes up with a bouquet of flowers and, you know, I get up to get them, and she walks right past me, and she puts them on the statue of the Buddha. He said, "Oh," he said. "Oh, so embarrassed, you know." He didn't say embarrassed, he said something like that. You know. Well, most of us wouldn't tell a story like that, you know. But the Dalai Lama does. I mean, he can laugh at himself that way. And you know, how stupid, standing up to receive the flowers that weren't meant for him. So I think you find this humor. Herb Bronstein, who teaches with us, always says, you know, that path is always accompanied by a diminution of ego. There's a lessening of ego, which is humility, a real humility, a profound humility. So, those are some of the characteristics. Now, in the study of comparative religions, what I think is extremely important is to cut the cake both ways. In other words, not just to say what are the differences between Jews and Christians and Muslims, but what's the difference between tribal Jews, Christians, Muslims, rational Jews, Christians, Muslims, psychic Jews, Christians, Muslims, and mystical. And the worst sin in interreligious dialogue is to compare bin Laden to the Dalai Lama. You see, if you're going to be fair, you got to compare tribal to tribal, rational to rational, psychic to psychic, mystical to mystic. Now, I would say that the differences between the levels of consciousness are more significant than the differences between the sacred paths. At the Parliament in Cape Town, Jim was nice enough to put me in a group I didn't belong in of some 350 religious leaders, and we were at tables of 8 for 3 days, and I was with, you know, this wonderful array of people, the head of Cambodian Buddhism, a Zen teacher from Japan, a rabbi from Cape Town, a priest working with the poor in Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. And in 3 days of conversation, we never had an argument. We never had a time of